All right, let's take a look at some problems that we start off with on our first assignment. So I've left some of them blank just because people didn't ask about them in class. However, if I look at this first one here, this is our first not a function, it's a no. And the reason it's a no is I have these repeated threes. So notice that this input value here goes to multiple different outputs. So an input has to have a unique output. Clearly this one has different ones. The domain, notice, is put in order and it is not repetitive. Same thing with the range. Now, the first one that students have trouble with regularly is number 4 and number 6. So number 4, it is a yes. Clearly, it passes the vertical line test. It only touches it once. The problem that people have is they actually do these domains and ranges actually backwards. So they do a pretty good job of labeling the points, for instance. So they go ahead and label this point -2, -3. But the problem is when they write down the domain and ranges, they have like infinity to -3, and it has to be in order. So infinity is obviously a lot larger than -3. So just make sure you check the order on these. The same thing happens on this one. When we first start out, if we start out by looking at it and saying, okay, we're going to start here in beep. So beep, most people get that right. Notice it's a parentheses because it's open circle. But if I start at the bottom, right? If I start at the bottom, what happens is some students will accidentally put this out of order. So we start beeping here, beep to infinity. So make sure you have a 4 there. In the absence of open is closed. So that's a square bracket to infinity. This one people normally do pretty well with. You just write the points down. So if you've had trouble with this one, list the points. This one people do very well with because it starts and stops, starts and stops. This one, again, people have the domains and ranges sometimes backwards. So when you look at that, you're going to want to start over here, beep, and then stop. So if you have 0 to -infinity, you're 90% correct, but you got to think about the order of that. Is 0 bigger or smaller than -infinity? It has to be in order. So -infinity to 0. It also helps, as I've mentioned before, to go ahead and label this arrow, right? This arrow in the X direction is going to -infinity, and in the Y direction is going to infinity. Okay, and the range, of course, is very similar, right? The range would be to start here at the bottom, beep to infinity. So -4, make sure you have a solid bracket. And then we get to these three, which people have trouble with until they realize there's actually just 2 problems. So if I wanted to do the domain here, do this domain, beep to 2. Then do this domain, 2, beep to infinity. And the way you connect those in math is using a union symbol, so union. And the range is very similar. You would just do 2 of them, so beep to 0, and then skip this space, and then beep forward to infinity. So why do I have parentheses and brackets? So it's kind of interesting, and this is something for later. Really, there's something in here that these don't touch. It actually has a special name. I don't want to scare you with it. It's called an asymptote. We'll learn about it in, I don't know, probably around December. It doesn't touch the vertical one. It does touch the horizontal one. So like it does touch the range value. That's why you have me see 0 there and I have a solid bracket, and 4, I have a solid bracket. But over here too, it's not going to touch this value here. So notice I use parentheses for the domain. That's something we'll learn later. Actually, we'll learn a little bit about it in the next lesson. Why don't I just call it a domain restriction? So that domain restriction means I don't include it. Now, the interesting thing about the range here is students will frequently say the range is -infinity to 0, but there's 2 of them, so they write them both down. But you don't want to write them both down because it's repetitive. So you'd cross this one out. So the range is beep to 0. Okay, and then this one is the same thing, but there's 3 of them, except the range is really interesting because there's 3 ranges, but watch, the middle one takes up everything. Beep. So in that case, the middle one encompasses anything you could write down because it's -infinity to infinity. That was a little challenging. We can talk more about it. Trying to stress about it, I just want to show you that sometimes the list gets overcome by the greater domain, or range. So in this case, the domain is this domain and that domain and that domain. That's perfectly right. But when you do the range, this one in the middle here encompasses everything. You can see it, right? You can see this line touching both of these graphs, and this, so the whole time it's everything. All right, on the back, to do inverses, you just reverse these. Very simple. Just reverse these, write it down, tell me if it's a function. For this one, you're just going to reverse the chart, right? Just going to reverse the chart. I didn't finish it. You'll finish that and turn it in. For these, you're just going to reverse the direction. So you're just going to go 10 to -2 and 9 to -2, and then tell me if that's a function. Down here, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to write down the points. You're then going to reverse the points. So you reverse all the points, and then you graph those points. With a graph, you pick 3 points, maybe include the arrow, write them down and reverse them, and then draw the graph. This graph, a lot of students think, isn't it the same? Notice that the intercepts have changed. So that graph looks very similar, but it is in fact the same. And you can tell it's the same if you write down this infinity to negative infinity thing, infinity to infinity part, you can tell that when I reverse that, it's still going to infinity, infinity. Unlike this graph, where if you write these down, you might want to make sure you label that as an open circle. Then what'll happen is the graph, if I write this down and reverse them, the graph inverse is here. And notice that this is negative infinity to infinity. And when I reverse that and get an infinity, negative infinity, it's going to be going down here in the corner. And then you're going to address, is it a function, yes or no, and then the domain and ranges.